Night Walks by Charles Dickens, read by John Wall. Some years ago, a temporary inability to sleep, referable to a distraction impression, caused me to walk about the streets all night, for the series of several nights. The disorder might have taken a long time to conquer, if it had been frankly experimented on in bed. But it was soon defeated by the brisk treatment of getting up directly after lying down and going out, and coming home tired at sunrise. In the course of those nights, I finished my education in a fair amateur experience of houselessness, my principal object being to get through the night. The pursuit of it brought me into sympathetic relations with people who have no other object every night in the year. The month was March, and the weather damp, cloudy, and cold, the sun not rising before 5:30. The night perspective looked sufficiently long at 12:30, which was about my time for confronting it. The restlessness of a great city, and the way in which it tumbles and tosses before it can get to sleep, form one of the first entertainments offered to the contemplation of us houseless people. It lasted about 2 hours. We lost a great deal of companionship when the late public houses turned their lamps out, and when the potmen thrust the last brawling drunkards into the street. But stray vehicles and stray people were left to us after that. If we were very lucky, a policeman's rattle sprang and the fray turned up, but in general, surprisingly little of this diversion was provided, except in the Haymarket, which was the worst kept part of London, and about Kent Street in the Borough, and along a portion of the line of the Old Kent Road, the peace was seldom violently broken. But it was always the case that London, as if in imitation of individual citizens belonging to it, had expiring fits and starts of restlessness. After all seemed quiet, if one kept rattled by, half a dozen would surely follow, and houselessness even observed that intoxicated people appeared to be magnetically attracted toward each other, so that we knew, when we saw one drunkard object staggering against the shutter of the shop, that another drunken object would stagger up before 5 minutes were out to fraternize it or fight with it. When we made a divergence from the regular species of drunkard, the thin-armed, pop-faced, leaden-lipped gin-drinker had encountered a rarer specimen of a more decent appearance, 50 to 1, but that specimen was dressed in soiled mourning. As the street experience in the night, so the street experience in the day. The common folk who come unexpectedly into a little property, come unexpected into a deal of liquor. At length, these flickering sparks would die away, worn out. The last veritable sparks of walking life trailed from some late peaman or hot potato man, and London would sink to rest. And then the yearning of the houseless mind would be for any sign of company, any lighted place, any movement, anything suggestive of anyone being up, nay, even so much as awake, for the houseless eye looked out for lights in windows. Walking the streets under the pattering rain, houselessness will walk and walk and walk, seeing nothing but the interminable tangle of streets, save at a corner, here or there, 2 policemen in conversation, or the sergeant or inspector looking after his men. Now and then in the night, but rarely, houselessness would become aware of furtive head, peering out of a doorway a few yards before him, and coming up with the head, will find a man standing bolt upright to keep within the doorway's shadow, and evidently intent upon no particular service to society. Under a kind of fascination, and in a ghostly silence suitable to the time, houselessness and the gentleman would eye one another from head to foot, and so, without exchange of speech, part, mutually suspicious. Drip, 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 from ledge and coping, splash from pipes and water sprouts, and by the houseless shadow will fall upon the stones that paved the way to Waterloo Bridge, to have a halfpenny worth of excuse for saying good night to the toll-keeper, and catching a glimpse of his fire, a good fire, and a good greatcoat, and a good woolen neck-shawl, were comfortable things to see in conjunction with the toll-keeper. Also his brisk wastefulness was excellent company when he rattled the change of halfpence down upon that metal table of his, like a man who defied the night. With all its sorrowful thoughts, it didn't care for the coming of dawn. There was need of encouragement on the threshold of the bridge, for the bridge was dreary. The chopped-up murdered man had not been lowered with a rope over the parapet when those nights were. He was alive, and slept then quietly enough most likely, and undisturbed by any dream of where he was to come. But the river had an awful look. The buildings on the banks were muffled in black shrouds, and the reflected lights seemed to originate deep in the water, as if the spectre of suicides were holding them to show where they went down. The wild moon and clouds were as restless as an evil conscience in the tumbled bed, and the very shadow of the immensity of London seemed to lie oppressively upon the river. Between the bridge and the two great theatres there was but a distance of a few hundred paces, so the theatres came next. Grim and black within, at night, those grey dried wells, and the lonesome to imagine, with the rows of faces faded out, the lights extinguished, and the seats all empty. One would think that nothing in them knew itself at such a time but Yorick's skull. In one of my night walks, as the church steeples were shaking the March winds, and rang with the strokes of 4, I passed the outer boundary of one of these great deserts to enter it. With a dim lantern in my hand, I groped my well-known way to the stage, and looked over the orchestra, which was like a great grave dug for the time of pestilence, into a void beyond, a dismal cavern of an immense aspect, with the chandelier gone dead like everything else, and nothing visible through the mist and the fog and the space, but tiers of winding sheets. The ground my feet were when last there. I had seen the peasantry of Naples dancing among the vines, reckless of the burning mountain which threatened to overwhelm them, was now in possession of a strong serpent of an engine horse, watchfully lying in wait for the serpent fire, and ready to fly at it if it showed its forked tongue. A ghost of a watchman, carrying a faint corpse candle, haunted the distant upper gallery and flitted away, retiring within the proscenium, and holding my life about my head towards the roll-up curtain, green no more, but black as ebony. My sight lost itself in a gloomy vault, showing faint indications in it of a shipwreck of canvas and cordage. Metals I felt much as a diver might at the bottom of the sea. In those small hours when there was no movement in the street, It afforded matter for reflection to take Newgate in the way, and touching its rough stone, to think of the prisoner in their sleep, and then to glance in at the lodge over the spiked wicket and see the fire and the light of the watching turnkeys on the white wall. Not an inappropriate time either, to linger by the wicked little debtor's door, shutting tighter than any other door one ever saw, which has been death's door to so many. In the days of the uttering of the forged £1 notes by people tempted up from the country, how many hundreds of wretched creatures of both sexes, many quite innocent, swung out of the pitiless and inconsistent world, with the tower of yonder Christian church of St. Sepulchre monstrously before their eyes. Is there any haunting of the bank parlour by the remorseful souls of old directors in the night of these later days, I wonder? Or is it as quiet as this degenerate Seldoma of her old Bailey? To walk on to the bank, lamenting the good old times and bemoaning the present evil period, would be an easy next step, so that I would take it, and would make my houseless circuit of the bank, and give a thought to the treasure within, likewise to the guard of soldiers passing the night there and nodding over the fire. Next I went to Billingsgate, in some hope of market people, but it proving as yet too early, crossed the London Bridge and got down by the waterside on the Surrey shore among the buildings of the great brewery. There was plenty going on at the brewery, and the reek, and the smell of grains, and the rattling of the plum dray horses at the mangers were capital company. Quite refreshed by having mingled with this good society, I make the new start with a new heart, setting the old King's Bench prison before me for my next object, and resolving, when I should come to the wall, to think of the poor Horace Kinch and the dry rot in man. A very curious disease, the dry rot in man, and difficult to detect the beginning of. It had carried Horace Kinch inside the wall of the old King's Bench prison, and it had carried him out with his feet foremost. He was a likely man to look at, in the prime of life, well-to-do, as clever as he needed to be, and popular among many friends. He was suitably married, and had healthy and pretty children, but like some fair-looking houses or fair-looking ships, he took the dry rot. The first strong external revelation of the dry rot in man is a tendency to lurk and lounge, to be street corners without intelligible reason, to be going anywhere when met, to be about many places rather than at any, to do nothing tangible, but to have an intention of performing a variety of intangible duty tomorrow or the day after. When this manifestation of the disease is observed, the observer will usually connect it with a vague impression once formed or received, that the patient was living a little too hard. He will scarcely have had leisure to turn it over in his mind, and form the terrible suspicion, dry rot, when he will notice a change for the worse in the patient's appearance, a certain slovenliness and deterioration, which is not poverty, nor dirt, nor intoxication, nor ill health, but simply dry rot. To this succeed a smell as of strong waters in the morning, to that a looseness respecting money, to that a stronger smell as of strong waters at all times, to that a looseness respecting everything, to that a trembling of the limbs, somnolency, misery, and crumbling to pieces. As it in wood, so it is in man. Dry rot advances at a compound usually quite incalculable. A plank is found infected with it, and the whole structure is devoted. Thus it had been with the unhappy Horace Kinch, lately buried by the small subscription. those who knew him had not nigh done saying, so well off, so comfortably established, with such a hope before him, and yet, it is feared, with a slight touch of dry rot. And lo, the man was all dry rot and dust. From the dead wall associated on those houseless nights with this too common story, I choose next to wander by Bethlehem Hospital, partly because he laid on my road round to Westminster, partly because I'd had a night fancy in my head, which could be best pursued within sight of its walls and the dome. And the fancy was this: are not the sane and the insane equal at nights, as the sane lie a-dreaming? Are not all of us outside this hospital who dream, more or less in the condition of those inside it, every night of our lives? Are we not nightly persuaded, as they daily are, that we associate preposterously with kings and queens, emperors and empresses, and notabilities of all sorts? Do we not nightly jumble events and personages and times and places as these do daily? Are we not sometimes troubled by our own sleeping inconsistencies, and do we not vexedly try to account for them or excuse them, just as these do sometimes, in respect of their waking delusions? Said an afflicted man to me, when I was last in the hospital like this, "Sir, I can frequently fly." I was half ashamed to reflect that so could I by night. Said a woman to me on the same occasion, "Queen Victoria frequently comes to dine with me, and Her Majesty and I dine off peaches and macaroni in our night gowns, and His Royal Highness the Prince Consort does us the honour to make a third on horseback in the Field Marshal's uniform." Could I refrain from rattling from the consciousness when I remember the amazing royal parties I myself had given at night, the unaccountable viands I had put on table, and my extraordinary manner of conducting myself on those distinguished occasions? I wonder that the great master who knew everything, when he called sleep the death of every day's life, did not call dreams the insanity of each day's sanity. By this time I had left the hospital behind me, and was again setting towards the river, and in a short breathing space I was on Westminster Bridge, regaling my houseless eyes with the external walls of the British Parliament, the perfection of a stupendous institution I know, and admiration of all surrounding nations and succeeding ages I do not doubt, but perhaps a little the better now and then, for being pricked up to this work. Turning off into Old Palace Yard, the courts of law kept me company for a quarter of an hour, hinting in low whisper what numbers of people they were keeping awake, and how intensely wretched and horrible they were, rendering the small hours to unfortunate shooters. Westminster Abbey was fine gloomy society for another quarter of an hour, suggesting a wonderful procession of its dead among the dark arches and pillars, each century more amazed by the century following it than by all the centuries going before. And indeed in those houseless night walks, which was even included cemeteries, where watchmen were round among the graves, as stated the time, and moved the telltale handle of an index which recorded that they had touched it at such an hour. It was a solemn consideration what enormous hearts of the dead belonged to one old great city, and how if they were raised while the living slept, there would not be the space of a pin's point in all the streets and ways for the living to come out into. Not only that, but the vast armies of dead would overflow the hills and the valleys beyond the city, and would stretch away all around it, God knows how far. When the church clock strikes, on houseless years in the dead of the night, it may be at first mistaken for company and held as such, but as the spreading circles of vibration, which you may perceive at such a time with great clearness, gold opening out, for ever and ever afterwards, widening perhaps, as the philosopher has suggested, in eternal space. The mistake is rectified, and the sense of loneliness is profound. Once it was after leaving the abbey and turning my face north, I came to the great steps of St. Martin's Church as the clock was striking 3. Suddenly, I think that in a moment more I should have trodden upon without seeing, rose up at my feet with a cry of loneliness and houselessness, struck out of it by the bell, the like of which I never heard. We then stood face to face, looking at one another, frightened by one another. The creature was like a beetle-browed, hair-lipped youth of 20, and it had a loose bundle of rags on, which it held together with one of its hands. It shivered from head to foot, and its teeth chattered, and, as it stared at me, prosecutor, devil, ghost, whatever it thought me, it made with its whining mouth as if it was snapping at me like a worried dog. Intending to give this ugly object money, I put out my hand to stay it, but it recoiled as it whined and snapped, and laid my hand upon its shoulder. Instantly it twisted out its garment, like the young man in the New Testament, and left me standing alone with its rags in my hands. Covent Garden Market, when it was market morning, was a wonderful company. The great wagons of cabbages, with growers' man and boy lying asleep under them, and with shop dogs from Market Garden neighborhood looking after the whole, were as good as a party. But one of the worst night sights I know in London is to be found in the children who prowl about this place, who sleep in the baskets, fight for the offal, dart at any object that they think they can lay their thieving hands on, dive under the carts and the barrels, dodge the constables, and are perpetually making a blunt pattering on the pavement of the piazza with the run of their naked feet. A painful and unnatural result comes from the comparison one is forced to institute between the growth of corruption as displayed in the so much improved and cared for fruits of the earth, and the growth of corruption as displayed in its all uncared for, except inasmuch as ever hunted savages. There was early coffee to be got about Covent Garden Market, and there was small company, warm company too, which was better. Toast of a very substantial quality was likewise procurable, though the tousle-headed man who made it, in the inner chamber within the coffee-room, hadn't got his coat on yet, and was so heavy with sleep that in every interval of toast and coffee he went off anew behind the partition into complicated crossroads of chalk and snow, and lost his way directly. Into one of these establishments, among the earliest, near Bow Street, there came one morning, as I sat over my houseless cup, pondering where to go next, a man in a high and a long snuff-colored coat and the shoes, and, to the best of my belief, nothing else but a hat, who took out of his hat a large cold meat pudding, a meat pudding so large that it was very tight fit, and brought the lining of the hat out with it. This mysterious man was known by his pudding, for on his entering, the man of sleep brought in a pint of hot tea, a small loaf, and a large knife and a fork and a plate, left to himself in his box. He stood the pudding on the bare table, and instead of cutting it, stabbed it overhand with his knife, like a mortal enemy, then took the knife out, wiped it on his sleeve, tore the pudding asunder with his fingers, and ate it all up. The remembrance of this man with the pudding remains with me, as the remembrance of the most spectral person my houselessness encountered. Twice only was I in that establishment, and twice I saw him stalk in, as I should say, just out of bed, and presently go back to bed, taking out his pudding, stab his pudding, wipe the dagger, and eat his pudding all up. He was a man whose figure promised cadaverousness, but who had an excessively red face, though shaped like a horse's. On the second occasion of my seeing him, he said huskily to the man of sleep, "Am I right tonight?" "You are," he uncompromisingly answered. "My mother," said the spectre, "was a red-faced woman that liked the drink, and I looked at her hard when she laid in her coffin, and I took the complexion. Somehow the pudding seemed an unwholesome pudding after that, and I put myself in this way no more." When there was no market, or when I wanted variety, a railway terminus, with the morning mails coming in, was remunerative company. But like most of the company to be had in this world, it lasted only a very short time. The station lamps would burst out ablaze, the porters would emerge from places of concealment, the cabs and the trucks would rattle to their places, the post office cards were already in theirs, and finally the bell would strike up, and the train would come banging in. But there were few passengers and little luggage, and everything scuttled away with the greatest expedition. The locomotive post offices, with their great nets, as if they had been dragging the country for bodies, would fly open as to their doors, and would disgorge a smell of lamp, an exhausted clerk, a guard in red coat, and their bags of letters. The engine would blow and heavy and perspire, like an engine wiping its forehead and saying what a run it had had. And within 10 minutes the lamps were out, and I was houseless and alone again. But now there were driven cattle on the high road near, wanting, as cattle always do, to turn into the midst of the stone walls, and squeeze themselves through 6 inches wide of iron railing, and getting their heads down, also as cattle always do, for tossing purchase at quite imaginary dogs, and giving themselves and every devoted creature associated with them a most extraordinary amount of unnecessary trouble. Now, too, the conscious guests began to go pale with the knowledge that daylight was coming, and straggling work-people were always in the streets. And as waking life had become extinguished with the last beaming sparks, so they began to rekindle with the fires of the first street corner breakfast sellers, and so by faster and faster degrees, until the last degrees were very fast. The day came, and I was tired and could sleep, and it is not, as I used to think, going home at such times, the least wonderful thing in London, that in the real desolation of the night, the houseless wanderer is alone there. I knew well enough where to find vice and misfortune of all kinds if I had chosen, but they were put out of sight, and my houselessness had many miles upon miles of streets in which it could, and did, have its own solitary way.